Hi everyone, welcome back to Pages of the Globe. Today I'm going to be reading to you the short story called The Rotifer by Mary Ladd Gavell. Now, this short story is very interesting and it's probably my favorite, and it has in total 3 smaller stories into it. So the Rotifer begins in a freshman biology class at a state university in Texas. And all the freshmen have gathered together in a lab. And the narrator is peering down their microscope, and they're looking at a rotifer. And they notice that the rotifer is entangled in a snarl of algae and can't get loose. And so they try to help the rotifer, but their actions make them completely lose sight of the rotifer. The second story talks about someone who is looking through old letters and records from a prominent family back in the day, and they learn about this child. And they feel like this child is being overworked, but this person can't help him as it takes place in the past. The third and final story depicts a girl whose cousin is about to get married, and she finds out some not so great things about the fiancé, but decides it's way too late to now uncover those things. Now, it took me a long time to figure out what the theme of the story was, and I tried to search for it, and it's not a very popular story, to be honest, and so I wasn't able to find anything. And at one point, I realized that all these stories have one common underlying theme, which is motherhood. Each of our main characters feels some kind of motherly pull, whether it's to a rotifer or a cousin. But they can't help these people because, as for the first example, when they do try to help, they completely lose sight of the, quote, child. And in the second one, they can't really help. And in the third one, it's way too late to help. And these are all common situations that mothers normally find themselves in as their children grow up. Now, before we start, I'm going to tell you a couple facts about the author, Mary Ladd Gavell. Now, Mary Ladd Gavell was born in 1999 and died in 1967. She died at the age of 47, having published nothing in her life. She was the managing editor of Psychiatry magazine in Washington, D.C. And after her death, her colleagues ran her story, The Rotifer, in the magazine as a tribute. The Rotifer was fortuitously discovered by John Updike, who called it a gem and included it in the best American short stories of the century. And then in 2001, a collection of short stories written by her were published, and it was called I Cannot Tell a Lie Exactly. And the interesting part of this is that when Mary Ladd Gavell died, her husband tried to publish these, and he sent it to the University of Texas. And they said, we love your stories, but we can't publish them because we don't publish fiction. So then the husband was like, okay. And then another famous publisher read The Rotifer in John Updike's Best American Short Stories of the Century. And he decided to contact the University of Texas again, but he was told, like before, that they don't publish fiction. And then they said, why don't you send it over to SMU Press? And SMU Press said, well, you know what, we love these short stories, but we don't have enough money to publish them. And then after a very long time, they did end up getting published. And so there was just this huge fight just to publish Mary Ladd Gavell's amazing short stories. And honestly, we are all very thankful that they did end up getting published because it was very good, very interesting short stories, and I would definitely recommend it to you. The Rotifer itself was first published in 1967, again by Psychiatry magazine. Now, without further ado, let's get started. Remember to like, share, subscribe, and comment down which story you would like to hear next. The Rotifer by Mary Ladd Gavell. Though I sit hunched studiously over my microscope, I'm gazing dreamily past it and out the open window at the lazy afternoon campus. But the lab instructor, a graduate student who stutters a little and dreams of the day when he will become an assistant professor, comes hovering down the row of tables, and I return to my microscope. I do not plan to become a biologist. 2 sciences are required, and I regard each with the detachment of the sophomore's frog's legs and sheep livers, each with a name tag attached, which float in the barrel of formaldehyde in the corner. It gives off a technical, advanced, arcane smell, but it does not stir me. Next year I shall be off to another lab and another science, and shall putter about with Bunsen burners or magnetic fields. It is late in the fall, although it is still warm here in Texas, and the faint sounds of football practice drift in through the open window. We 40 freshmen in this room have, since our arrival at the State University, from the sleepy cactusy towns and the raw cities and the piney woods and the plains, been learning about the protozoa, the one-celled creatures who simply divide when they want to become 2, and are not always sure whether they are plants or animals. The lab instructor has hovered over us yearningly, wanting us to get a good view of the amoeba and really appreciate the spirogyra. But today, as he gives us a glass slide with a drop of pond water on it, he tells us that we are leaving the protozoa and beginning the long evolutionary climb. Today we shall see the rotifers, who belong to the metazoa. We too, at the other end of the microscope, are metazoa. The rotifer, like us, has a brain, a nervous system, and a stomach. I'm fairly good by this time at adjusting my microscope. I know that those long, wavy fronds are reflections of my own eyelashes, and I can recognize algae when I see it. Greenish leafy stuff, rather like the broccoli on the dormitory dinner plate. Soon I find the rotifers, furiously alive, almost transparent little animals churning powerfully along their native ocean. Soon I find the rotifers, furiously alive, almost transparent little animals. Soon I find the rotifers, furiously alive, almost transparent little animals churning powerfully along in their native ocean. Watching, I am a witness to a crisis in the life of a rotifer. He is entangled in a snarl of algae, and he can't get loose. His transparent little body chugs this way and that, but the fence of the algae seems impenetrable. He turns, wiggles, oscillates, but he is caught. "Rest a moment," I whisper to him. "Lie still and catch your breath, and then give a good heave to the left." But he is in a wild panic beyond any reasonable course of action. It seems to me that his movements are slowing down, as if he is becoming exhausted. Maybe I can help him. Perhaps I can put my finger on the edge of the glass slide and tip it over ever so slightly, tilted just enough so that the water will wash him over the barrier. Cautiously, I touch the slide, but the result is a violent revolution in the whole rotifer universe. My rotifer and his algae prison wash recklessly out of sight, and the whole world of rotifers and algae and the whole other world of rotifers and algae and amobia and miscellaneous creatures of the deep reel. My rotifer and his algae prison wash recklessly out of sight, and whole other worlds of rotifers and algae and amoeba and miscellaneous creatures of the deep reel by, spinning on the waves of cataclysm. My rotifer is gone to me, lost, huge and clumsy, more gargantuan than any Gulliver. I am separated from him forever by my monstrous size, and there's no way I can get through from my dimension to his. The bell rings. Lab is over. I take out my slide from under the microscope. there is on it the merest drop of water, and I look at it uncertainly. I start to wipe it off, to put the slide away, but I hesitate and look at it again. The lab instructor, seeing me still standing there, hurries over. "Did you get a good conception of the ciliary movement?" he asked me anxiously. "I guess so," I answer, and I polish the slide until it is dry and shiny and put it away. Like that earnest young man, the lab instructor, I became for a little while, a few years later, an intellectual sharecropper, as we called young graduate students who had various ill-defined and ill-paid functions around the university. During this period, I was for some reason handed the job of going through the papers of the Benton family, which a descendant looking for something suitable to do with them had turned over to the university. The Bentons had been a moderately prominent family who had moved from the east to Tennessee in the 1790s, and then, for 30 years or so years later, to the southwest. They were notable for being respectable, prosperous, God-fearing, and right-doing lawyers and landowners, and they were also notable for having saved most of the papers that came into their hands. All these qualities had culminated into Josiah Benton, who had been state treasurer in the 1840s and had saved every paper he had gotten his hands on. For weeks and weeks I sat in a corner of the archives library, turned through fragile, yellowed papers, making out the dim and faded handwriting of the Benton love letters, lists of Benton expenditures for curtain material and camisoles, reports and complaints to various Bentons from their tenants, letters to traveling Benton husbands from Benton wives, bills of sale for Benton slaves, political gossip from Benton cronies and domestic gossip from Benton relatives, diaries begun and never finished, and a few state papers filched by Josiah, much like any other bureaucrat after him, from the official files. It was impossible not to become interested in the Bentons. I sat down with boxes of ancient gossip and circumstance more eagerly than I asked a friend, "What's new?" Lydia May Benton feuded with her sister-in-law Sally, and the mysterious trouble about Jonathan Bentley. It turned out that he drank. Aunt Millie Benton's letters to her traveling husband began and ended with protestations of devotion and obedience, but in between she told him what to do and when to do it. But if Josiah's wife, Lizzie, had ever had an opinion, it went unrecorded. When she was mentioned at all, it was to say how dear, sweet, and good ailing poor Lizzie was. Josiah emerged like a rock. He was honest, he was rigid, he was determined, and he carried through what he began. But it was his son, little Robert Josiah Benton, who interested me the most. There was little said about Robert Josiah before 1832, when at 10 he was sent away to a school in Massachusetts. There had, of course, been a few references to him earlier. When he was born, Josiah, whose first 2 children had been girls, wrote proudly to his brother, "My Lizzie was delivered of a fine 8-pound boy this morning. I shall make him, God willing, a scholar and a gentleman." Later on, in one of the few letters that Lizzie seemed to have received, her sister, who had recently been to visit them, had exclaimed over what a beautiful and clever child your Robert Josiah is. And once, when Robert Josiah must have been about 8, Josiah's list of expenditures included to roan horse for my son. Robert Josiah was sent to Massachusetts to be made into a scholar and a gentleman, as Josiah had probably written the headmaster of the school. "According to your instructions," the headmaster replied, "your son will be given a thorough grounding in mathematics and Latin, with somewhat subordinate attention given to the French and to those sports which befit a gentleman. You will receive quarterly reports from me as to the progress of your son, and the rules of our school require that each scholar shall write to his father fortnightly, so that you shall be well informed concerning his welfare." I personally supervised the writing of these letters, ascertaining that they contained no misleading statements as the inexperience and frivolity of youth might give them a tendency to do, so that you shall at all times receive and have a true and correct account. Robert Josiah went away to school at the end of summer. In the fall and winter months, the fortnightly letters appeared, painfully neat, carefully spelled, stiff little letters, beginning, "My dear respected father." Lizzie was not addressed, although somewhere in the letter, Robert Josiah would say, "Give my dear love to my mother." The letters always ended, "Your obedient son." He would report that he was well and he was studying hard in order to gain the full benefits of the advantages his father was so generously providing him, and that he was treated with the utmost consideration by the professors and by the headmaster, and that he hoped that the headmaster's reports of him would be found to be satisfactory. Once he said he found Latin very difficult, but he hastened to add, "Do not believe, dear father, that I question on this account your wisdom in desiring me to study it, or that I shall neglect it." Sometimes he apologized for the shortness of the letter, by saying, "I am only allowed one candle, and it is almost finished." At Christmas, he went so far to say, "I miss my dear mother and you very much, and my sisters also, but I shall try to overcome it and devote my attention more fully to my studies." Often he would inquire about his horse, whose name was Jupiter, and about Nero, his dog. "Does Timothy take good care of Jupiter and Nero?" he would ask. And so the letters continued, stiff, polite, adult little notes, but sometimes a barely wistful, faintly childish sound crept into them, once in a while when it became perfectly clear that Robert Josiah wanted to come home. In January he failed to write, and instead the headmaster wrote that Robert Josiah was ill, in a mild attack of the grippe, but felt confident that he would be soon fully recovered. And apparently he was, for 2 weeks later his letters resumed. But now he wrote, "I wish I could see my dear mother." Then a letter appeared from John Benton, an older cousin of Robert Josiah's, who was attending Harvard College and who had had an occasion on returning to college from a short vacation to stop by Robert Josiah's school. "My dear uncle," he wrote, "I trust that you will forgive this extreme liberty which I am taking in addressing you regarding my recent visit with your son, Robert Josiah. Your son looks very thin as a result of his recent bout with grippe, and I think perhaps he is studying too hard. I have no doubt that the headmaster of the school is an extremely fine and conscientious scholar, and that his school is an excellent one, but his regime is most rigorous. And while some boys no doubt profit greatly from this, I think it might be too severe at this stage for Robert Josiah, who is perhaps of a delicate constitution, and of course still of the tender years. I beg to assure you that the attitude of Robert Josiah is one of a loving obedience to your wishes, and I trust that you will forgive, my dear uncle, this intrusion of mine into your family affairs, since I am confident of your excellent judgment in all matters. Your respectful nephew, John Benton." Well, it was a good thing that somebody had looked in on our little Robert Josiah to see how he really was. But the question was, would anyone as determined as Josiah listen? Apparently not. The weeks passed, and stiff little letters kept coming from Robert Josiah. But they were more openly homesick now, and once or twice he wandered curiously from the subject he was writing. Probably John's letter had merely rubbed Josiah the wrong way. He was, after all, only a young upstart of a nephew. Somebody else would have to try and make Josiah understand that Robert Josiah needed to come home, and there was no relying on Lizzie, poor, pale, ailing little thing, probably worried sick, but unable to have an opinion on anything. But somebody had to do something. Josiah was not mean, he was just rigid, opinionated. But somebody had to do something. Josiah was not mean, he was just rigid, opinionated. Josiah was not mean, he was just rigid, opinionated and ambitious. He could be made to understand. Frantically, I searched in my mind for the right tack to take with Josiah, the best way to put it into him. But then something happened. Maybe a student going out of the library banged a door, and past and present whirled around me in waves and washed me up at a library table well into the second half of the 20th century, and yellow old papers stacked around me. It had happened in 1832, and they were all dead and gone. There was nothing I could do for little Robert Josiah. I could hold in my hands the letters that he had written, read the words he had put down there, but I was far, far away, separated from him by more than a century. There was nothing I could tell his father. There was no way I could get through from my dimension to his. Rather half-heartedly, I looked for the rest of the letters. There were just 2, 3, or more from little Robert Josiah, and then they stopped. There was nothing more. There were accounts, bills, business letters, and later on, more personal letters to Josiah, but there was nothing mentioning Robert Josiah. I read through 30 or 40 more years of Benton papers, but I never saw another word about a son of Josiah Benton's. My cousin Leah and I grew up in different parts of the country, and we never knew each other well. When she came to live in the city where I now worked, we felt an obligation to be friendly, but the friendliness was a trifle forced, weighed down by our family's expectation that we would have a great deal to say to each other, and the inescapable fact that we did not. We rang each other up from time to time to chat and exchange family news, and since she was new to the city, I introduced her to my friends. But she was 6 years younger than I, and the people that I knew seemed jaded to her. They were not really jaded at all, but then almost anybody seemed a little battered beside Leah. Leah's father, my uncle, was old when she was born. His first wife had died, leaving 4 sons already grown, and eventually he married again, a gentle girl who gave him 1 daughter and died shortly afterward. People wondered how that stern, hard old man was going to manage with a little girl, but he managed very well. A tender fatherliness flowered inside him which his sons had never known. He and Leah were always together. They rode horseback over his farms together and supervised the haying together and went shopping for clothes together, and the old man, looking as out of place as possible, but calm in the conviction that here, as everywhere else in the world, all you had to do was make it plain what you wanted and be able to pay for it. My uncle was a rich man, not private yacht kind of rich, but a Midwest farming kind of rich, turn out the lights when you're finished with them and don't dip into your principal kind of rich. When Leah got into her teens and began to be beautiful, he sent her to the best girls' school he could get her into, because he figured their reputation might not be much, but it was all he had to go on. But first he asked them what they had to teach her that she could earn her living by. She became a commercial artist, and eventually came to the city and got a job. The best word I can think of to describe her when I first encountered her, 21, all grown up and on her own, is dazzling. She was radiant. She twinkled and glittered and dazzled like a diamond. Yet her strange, pure, golden brown eyes looked out at the world with the simplicity and delight of a child. She saw the best in everyone. She met a notorious misogynist and thought of him so sweet and shy, and she was introduced to a celebrated old lecturer and reported that he was so good all through that he reminded her a lot of her daddy. She made me nervous, but she was sharing an apartment with 2 former schoolmates, and 3 of them all as lovely and charming and gay as if they had been turned out by some heavenly production line, giggling and putting up each other's hair, wearing each other's clothes, living off peanut butter sandwiches, and chewing over their combined worldly wisdom like so many puppies with a shoe, presented themselves in an invincible girls' dormitory armor to the world. And I was, after all, young myself, and in no mood to worry, in love with the city, with my job as an international organization, and as I recall it, with the third executive assistant of the British delegation. Then she called me up one night to say that she was engaged and was going to be married right away. He was a junior associate in the well-known law firm of Jude, Parker, and Avery, and his credentials of his age, height, education, and background seemed impeccable. I felt that she emphasized his suitability a trifle for my benefit. She put me in the older relative category. Her father was not too well. He had recently had an operation, and she was planning to go home and see him, so they had decided to be married here the following Sunday and to go home together. On Saturday night, her roommates were throwing a little party for them at the apartment, and would I come and meet Dick then? I said I'd love to, and I wished her all the happiness in the world. That was Monday night, and I had such a busy week that I didn't have much time to think about Leah. A series of international meetings kept me working late every night. On Wednesday, I didn't get away until almost midnight, and I was exhausted when I finally caught a cab. I sank back, wiggled out of my high-heeled shoes in the dark. The cab driver had a girlfriend with him in the front seat. I suppose it's lonely work, cruising the night streets. She leaned against his shoulder, and when he stopped at a red light, he rested his head companionably against her shoulder. He said something monosyllabic, and she laughed. I thought wisely, looking at the backs of their heads, that they were too comfortable in their closeness to be a young dating pair, but were old lovers, or married. When we got to my address, he turned on the light for a moment to make change. I saw that he was good-looking and probably in his late 20s, and that she was about the same age, pretty, with a mop of blonde hair and blue jeans. I must pause here to explain that I am a recognizer of people. I am sort of a pageant or a scoffer of recognizing. People who say, I remember faces but I just can't remember names, are amateurs. I remember thousands of faces, for which I have never known a name. The streets swarm with them. People who once did my hair or sold me shoes, stood next to me in elevators and ticket lines or at fires, gave me a new blouse in exchange for one that didn't fit, or 4 words at a cocktail party in exchange for 4 of mine. I remember them all, but they cut me dead. The first time I ever set forth on the streets of Paris, I was with a friend, a woman who occupied a high position in the international organization for which I worked, and who had, as it happened, been mainly responsible for firing from that organization a year or so before, of a French man named Charpentier. The reason being general quarrelsomeness, I think. No doubt his side of the story was different. I never knew all the ins and outs of it. He returned to the French civil service from whence he had come, but not before delivering some fairly painful parting shots. My friend and I stopped from the boat train out into the spring morning sunshine of Paris, bent on nothing but pleasant errands, and at once I recognized M. Charpentier on the street. I was used to domestic recognizing. At home, I dampened down the recognizing smile on my face as automatically as I glanced at the traffic lights. But I lost my head in such a stunning foreign success, and cried out, Monsieur Charpentier! He stopped, we stopped, and the shock turned both of their faces to concrete. He gave a short, savage jerk of a bow, and her teeth met gears as she ground out a greeting between them. It had been the dearest wish of both of their hearts never to see each other again. As the hostess, so to speak, in the situation, I babbled something like, How nice is it to see you once more? And how beautiful is your city, speaking pidgin English, although his own was perfect. He looked at me with only a mixture of loathing and bewilderment. We had known each other only slightly a year or more before, and he had not recognized me. My friend and I proceeded on our way, but a shadow had settled over the day. She was rather silent, and I smiled whenever I caught her eye. Uriah heapishly. Paris had never been the magic city to me that it is to some. On Saturday night, I went to my cousin's apartment and met her fiancé. He was a good-looking young man in his late 20s, with a conservative tie, a direct eye, and a firm handshake. He greeted me with a special cousinly warmth. His manner toward Leah was a charming mixture of serious protectiveness and teasing adoration. And of course, he didn't recognize me. There was not the faintest cloud in his clear young gaze. My cousin was radiant. She flitted among the guests like a sprite. "Tell me, Mary," she whispered when she alighted near me for a moment. "What do you think of him? Isn't he wonderful? Isn't he?" "He's very handsome and very charming," I said. "Oh, I'm so glad you like him," she cried, and she gave me a hug. "You and Dad are the only people I want to like him. I don't care about anybody else." And she was off. Well, I suppose that more than one struggling young professional man has driven a cab at nights to make a little extra. And surely many a young man has an old Louvre to be off we before he be on what? And surely many a young man has been an old Louvre to be off we before he be on we the new. And if the timetable's a bit crowded, it's not a hanging offense. I'm as broad-minded as the next, and yet this was my little cousin, Leah, my beautiful, shining little cousin, with whom I had not had a blessed thing in common, who thought all the world loved her as well as her daddy did. I looked at the young man again. I imagined his neatly cut face was clearly sinister, and his every word and gesture was plainly false. Was he really a lawyer with Jude, Parker, and Avery? It would be possible to find out. I could in fact simply call them up and ask on some pretext or another. But it was Saturday night, and the wedding was on Sunday, and on Monday I wouldn't want to know. Or I could tell him right then and there, look at him right in the sincere blue eye, and tell him that I had seen him driving a cab last Wednesday night with a blonde young woman under circumstances suggestive of considerable intimacy, and what, as a promising young lawyer on the eve of marriage to my cousin, did he have to say about that? But how in the name of heaven could I say that? It was melodramatic. It was a line to be delivered by an outraged father back to the fireplace, or perhaps by a worldly erect old aunt in her parlor, shooting a severe glance past her teacup. I simply couldn't manage it. I was only a cousin about his age, and considerably less self-assured than he looked, spectacles slipping woefully down my nose, licensed in neither duenna nor private eye, nervous about making a fool of myself and showing it, in the crush of a large party in a small apartment, where it took a shout to be heard at all, and elbows jostled in conversations from all sides. And after all, what if I were mistaken? The possibility had been granted, and it would not make a very auspicious beginning for us all. And anyway, it was too late. The chapel was reserved, the wedding dress hung on its satin hanger in the closet, and the organist was instructed to play I Love You Truly. When I left that night, I suddenly at the door, without intending to at all, threw my hands around Leah and held her tight. There she was, my little cousin, my equal, my contemporary, within the circle of my arms. But I was separated from her forever by all the complexities of what I did not know and could not do. Our lives carried us in our own dimensions, like people passing off on different escalators, heading long to meet whatever harm or good was to come their way. And so I left her awkwardly. I smiled jerkily at the bridegroom, who gave me a cousinly peck on the cheek. We all said something about seeing each other the next day. I had dinner with them a couple months later, after they returned to the city. They seemed very happy, and the stars shone in Leah's eyes as brightly as ever. I couldn't say I liked him, but there was as I looked over him, this time more quietly and leisurely, something reassuring about his very ordinariness. He simply didn't have the stuff in him to be a Bluebeard or a Landru. He was a bright enough, nice enough young man who I surmised thought his way to be a little more winning and other people a little more simple than they were, whose eye was firmly fixed on the main chance. But that was the worst I could think of him. I was glad I hadn't tried to confront him with my silly cab riding story. It wouldn't have done anyone any good, and perhaps it was all a mistake anyway. They left the city shortly afterward. Leah called to tell me that an opportunity had opened up for Dick out in the Midwest, and he was leaving Jude, Parker, and Avery. She was glad because she would be nearer to her father. They were divorced about a year later, very shortly after her father died, and my cousin is back in the city with a job doing fashion ad illustrations. I assumed she was just working to keep herself busy, but a newsy old aunt of mine who was through town recently tells me that not so. Leah will be a rich woman one day, but at present she has to make her living, for her father, just before he died, changed his will so as to tie up the money very securely for a good while to come. I don't know why the divorce. Of course, mental cruelty or something, I suppose, but it's nothing I can ask Leah about unless she wants to talk about it. Dick immediately got married again, to a cheap, fuzzy-headed little blonde, as my aunt puts it. Leah's still a handsome woman, but the dazzle is gone, and she looks tired around the eyes. But so do I. So in time does everybody else.